Granted. There being no objection, leave is granted. Senator Siewert.
Thank you. The Australian Greens are strongly supportive of responsible and much-needed reform within the aged care sector. As our population continues to age, the already significant challenges faced by the sector will increase, and they can only be addressed through comprehensive reform, and we see this reform as part of that process. This reform has been sought after by consumers, aged care providers and workers. Instead of whipping up hysteria around these changes, we actually listened to what people had to say. We know that people support these reforms, and that in particular the majority of aged care providers support these reforms, although want some amendments, which I'll address through this contribution. Aged care has not dominated the agenda in the way that other major reforms have this year, but it is a vitally important reform that will touch most lives at some point, whether now they are helping a loved one access services and the care they need, or whether they are accessing that care themselves. I know that many organisations have been working in this reform over a long period of time and have successfully put aged care into the political agenda, first with the Productivity Commission process and then through the NACA blueprint. It's because of this tenacity that there will be more options for care, and particularly more options in home care, that will help Australians to be able to age in place for as long as possible, with flexible care that can change as their needs change. The Australian Greens believe that all people should be supported with high-quality services, regardless of their capacity to pay. So it is particularly pleasing that the funding is available to support vulnerable people who are unable to meet the costs of on their own. For this reason, I'm incredibly disappointed not to be able to move. So for this reason, we have particularly addressed the issue of homelessness. As we indicated in our contribution through the committee process, we highlighted this issue, and also my colleague Adam Bant spoke of this issue in the lower house. There are services such as the Winteringham services, and I acknowledge representative in the chamber, in the gallery now. These organisations do absolutely amazing work of providing care and support to some of the most marginalised and disadvantaged members of our community. Individuals who have experienced homelessness are highly likely to need specialised support to address complex behavioural and mental health needs. While facilities such as Winteringham facility have managed to cobble together some of the mainstream funding available, evidence presented to the inquiry clearly demonstrated that the service had lost about $20 a day per resident with the introduction of the new ACFI arrangements. Given that these services are not likely to be collecting any fees from their residents, their long-time viability has been and is in question. Our preference at this stage, as I circulated an amendment in the chamber, would have been to move an amendment to the legislation. Unfortunately, due to some complications, that is not possible, so I indicate I will be withdrawing the amendments that specifically relate to the homelessness supplement. However, as I said, that would have been our preference because of those difficulties unable to happen. One of the pieces of correspondence I have tabled is a commitment by the Minister Butler to implement a homelessness supplement through the principals process, and that commitment will be operationalised over the next couple of days and will be implemented on the 29th of June. So, in other words, the government has committed funding to a homelessness supplement, which will work in combination with the viability supplement. Minister Butler outlines in his correspondence, I understand he'll also make a statement about this, that this will be a transitional supplement while the viability supplement is reviewed, and that transitional supplement will continue until a new proper homelessness supplement will put in place. That homelessness supplement will be $15 a day and will work in combination with the other supplements that services that provide services to homeless people will be able to access. I think that is a very positive move, and I'm very pleased that the government has agreed to implement that homelessness supplement. Similarly, I'm glad to see that LGBTI people who will also be enshrined as a special needs category in the legislation. This is another group of people that have been marginalised when it comes to accessing aged care services, and recognising them in this legislation will ensure that there is a focus on addressing discrimination on the basis of sexuality in all training and planning aspects of aged care. I believe this is a group who also need legal protections from discrimination, which is why the Greens so strongly supported the amendment that passed through this place earlier this week. As well as these particular groups, the Greens welcome the range of other special needs that have been acknowledged in this legislation, including culturally and linguistically diversity and care leavers. I'm also particularly glad that the government has taken up the committee recommendation to amend the bill to make amendments to include those affected by forced adoptions, an issue that everybody in this place will know is very close to my heart. Similarly, the addition of specialised supplements for veterans and dementia care is welcome. I'm very supportive of the renaming of the dementia supplement to acknowledge that the supplement also covers cognitive and complex behaviours. However, broader mental health needs still seem to have missed out. Older Australians should have access to quality mental health services just like other Australians, and this can be particularly difficult in residential care, the same as we know accessing GP services in residential aged care is also difficult. The government response notes the review of the legislation should include the mental health needs of older Australians, and the Australian Greens believe that the government should consider creating a special supplement for mental health once that review has been carried out. All of these improvements, along with a significant increase in the number of packages available and funding for wages, are welcome. But the Australian Greens also recognise that in order to ensure access and quality of care in the face of rapidly increasing demand, aged care services need to be financially viable and capable of achieving growth. This legislation will provide the architecture for our aged care system's future. However, there are limits on the scope of this reform because the government didn't go as far as implementing all of the recommendations from the Productivity Commission. Clearly, the issue of aged care, how aged care is to be funded into the future, is going to need ongoing discussion with the broader Australian community as this pressure increases. Nevertheless, this legislation does represent some significant changes to the way aged care is delivered. For example, consumers will have access to greater control over how they pay for their care. They will also be expected to contribute to the cost of their care if they can afford it. The asset-rich, income-poor consumers who have largely avoided paying for high care places will now contribute the same as everybody else, as somebody else with the same overall means but a different mix of assets and income. The distinctions between high care and low care and the associated restrictions on who can pay, who is asked to pay for their care will disappear. Overall, more consumers will be contributing to the cost of their accommodation and care, and providers have to also contend with increased control for consumers to choose if they want to pay their accommodation as a daily payment or as a lump sum contribution. The overall viability of this sector is an issue of concern to us. As well as participating in this inquiry, I have consulted widely with the sector and taken very seriously the concerns of industry about the impacts of legislation could have on their individual businesses. Their ability to navigate the new system and implement these reforms on the ground will determine how many more aged care places are available and the quality of those services, which in turn, of course, is crucial for delivering better aged care for consumers. The current reform package does not necessarily achieve neutrality because the new daily accommodation payments, DAPs, and refundable accommodation payments, the RADs, it's clear that there isn't neutrality between those because of the decision to maintain existing arrangements for the primary residents in the assets test. The most significant change to residential care is focused on the lump sum payments, formerly accommodation bonds, which are now, as I said, the RADs. There will now be a clearer link between the cost of delivering accommodation and the lump sum and the cost of that accommodation, whether that's reflected in the lump sum deposits that individuals use to pay or whether they choose to pay daily accommodation payments. While these reforms put restrictions on the size of the bonds, they increase the total pool who can pay their accommodation fee through a lump sum and also as part of lifting the distinction between high care and low care. That means more people will be potentially paying lump sums or, in fact, as part of their care. With this reform, with this reform, those consumers who may have waited too long to enter care because of the perceived barrier that large low-care low care bonds have represented will have more options available to them, including the daily accommodation payments, as well as being able to form combinations of daily payments and a lump sum. However, as a result, providers have to face a situation of less certainty about how consumers will choose to pay their contributions, and their evidence to the committee inquiry demonstrated that this does have implications for their business planning, given the industry's heavy reliance on the capital that upfront bond payments provide. In other words, they use that money to build new accommodation. A move away from lump sums will require them to find new ways to attract bank loans to finance their operations and to build new facilities and service their debt. These are all matters that I had considered very seriously, particularly as there are a number of very effective, capable providers who run important services for low-income Australians who have largely low care beds or in regional areas. These services have been and will continue to be performing ongoing juggling acts to make ends meet. These reforms must strengthen rather than undermine these services. The KPMG modelling on the financial implications of this reform have helped resolve some of these concerns by trying to quantify the effects of the capital available to aged care providers. But I acknowledge that this modelling cannot account for all factors, and I've made that point in our additional comments to the committee inquiry. I recognise that for many providers, given that this modelling may not have resolved all their concerns about what real customers may actually choose to do, because you can't model everything, because people are human and make decisions not necessarily based on financial decisions, which is what the modelling was based on. There are a number of reasons why people make particular decisions whether to choose a lump sum or daily payment. I acknowledge that there will be some uncertainty for them to contend with as the industry is in transition, which is why I spent a lot of time talking to providers and why the overwhelming message from most of the providers was they want this legislation to go through because we need reform. The shift in the industry financing structures will be gradual, as all existing contracts, in other words, all people at the moment currently in aged care, will be grandfathered under transitional arrangements, but short-term liquidity problems will need to be addressed immediately once issues become apparent. We cannot leave that until the general review of the legislation later down the track. We must address these problems as they arise. However, the Australian Greens are reluctant to address the issue, or don't want to address the issue, the equivalence between the treatment of the lump sum and the daily payment by simply allowing lump sum payments to also receive protection from asset testing. The Australian Greens believe this would unwind most of the progress that has been made in ensuring that assets are means tested and that consumers contribute to the cost of their care. This would in turn undermine the financial viability of the sector into the future. We in fact did ask for modelling of these particular various options, and we can see no way of addressing the inequity between daily payments and RADs unless changes are made about addressing the value of the primary residence. And as yet, Australia is not prepared to address that issue, so we cannot fix this particular problem. We can, however, look at how we address any transitional problems, any viability problems for the sector. This is why the Australian Greens have introduced amendments to recognise the Aged Care Financing Authority in the legislation as a specialised monitoring body separate from the Department of Health and Ageing, with a similar composition of industry experience to its current membership. And one of the documents I tabled addresses some of the requests that the Minister has made to ACFA in their work and in their review process. ACFA can undertake this monitoring work with a view to ensuring the financial viability of the sector and provide timely analysis and make recommendations to the government about how and when to implement transitional arrangements that can address liquidity and capital problems as they arise. I'm glad that the government has also responded to our concerns with an upfront commitment to subsidise business advisory services to residential aged care providers that need assistance to implement the new accommodation payment system, and that was some of that information was articulated in the government's response to the Senate inquiry. We have also been concerned about how consumers will be affected by the new co-contribution component and have paid particular attention to the new home care fees. While full pensioners will receive greater support under this legislation, and we're very supportive of that and appreciate the fact that our most vulnerable consumers and people have been addressed in this manner in this legislation. However, low-income part pensioners may face some relatively large fee increases, while still facing a range of other cost of living pressures. It would be disappointing if this group began to self-ration their care dollars. This has been raised as a potential issue during the inquiry, and we looked carefully at this issue. But unfortunately, if we start fiddling with the taper rates, that would lead to a reduction in number of packages available. We are not sure if this will have a negative impact. The increase in the care will have a negative impact in terms of self-rationing. This is another issue that we expect ACFA to watch closely and advise the government on. Again, ACFA has, this issue cannot be left into the long term. If people are self-rationing care, if they are unable to meet the costs of care, then action needs to be taken as soon as possible. ACFA has a comprehensive work plan set out in the letter that I have tabled in this place, and we will very carefully watch ACFA implementing its work plan. They are essential, to my mind, in terms of how these reform processes are going to work. On the whole, the Australian Greens believe that the Living Longer legislation is an important step forward in ensuring quality care is accessible to all older Australians. For that reason, we also, I've got to say, support the workforce supplement, but appreciate the fact that the government has made some changes to that, and we support the changes the government has made to address some of the concerns of the sector. Our amendments and the commitments that the government has made in response to the very comprehensive committee inquiry have improved the bills further. What we now have before us is an architecture that should ensure that the delivery of better outcomes for older Australians and the aged care sector alike, both now and into the future. We have listened carefully to all the stakeholders involved in this discussion. It is very clear to us that aged care providers want this reform. Yes, there are concerns with this reform. We are concerned about some of the waiting for the daily accommodation payment and what that will do to consumer choices. In other words, they may choose the daily payments. However, until we are ready to have a broader discussion, which I agree with the government, this community, Australian community, is not yet ready to have that broader discussion about how we use some of our accumulated assets to pay for our care into the future. This is the best we can do. We very carefully looked at what the options were for a different modelling, for taking into account what's in and out of the assets test, bearing in mind that the assets test is linked directly to the aged care pension assets means testing process. There was certainly not an appetite to delink those two. You cannot make any other changes to the DAPS and RAD unless you are prepared to significantly increase the cost of care or to take the guts out of this package in terms of funding, and we're not prepared to do that. The Greens will be supporting the package of these bills. We strongly support the passing of these bills, and on the basis of the homelessness supplement and also the amendments that we have already tabled in the Senate. We support these bills.
Thank you, Senator.